Okay, in this video we're going to talk about reading a CSV file in C# using .NET and Visual Studio. And we're going to use a real-world electrical engineering example. So what is CSV? Well, CSV stands for comma-separated value. And from the name you can imagine that each value is separated by a comma. And here I've got an example CSV file that we're going to use for this tutorial. And in fact, a CSV file is pretty much just a text file, but the format is, as you can see here, each value is separated from the other values by a comma. Now, if you look at this file, there's a lot of different types of data on each line. The first two lines have forward slashes, and in this case, the forward slashes means that's a comment that when you're reading this in and parsing it, you can just skip over that line because it's just a comment. There's also groups of data. In this case, these 4 lines are grouped under bus data. So each component describes a bus. And that is an actual real-world piece of equipment in an electric power system. And then here I've got load data. So there's another type of data, and there's 4 lines with different type of data, and you can see the data in each type is different. Here you've got a string in the second character. Here there is no string, so it's a completely different type of data. And each type of data is terminated by a 0. You can see you've got 4 lines and then a 0, and then a comment and 4 more lines, a different type of data, and a 0. And each time you encounter a 0, that is a terminator that says, okay, you've finished this type of data, now you're going on to the next type of data. So you can see there's a lot of things we need to take into account when we're reading this data in. We've got to allow for the comments. We have to separate this data into types, and that's terminated by a 0, and so on. Now, if you think about a spreadsheet, here's an Excel spreadsheet down here. Generally, you've got rows and columns, and each type of data is under what's called a header. And the header describes the type of data in that column. So in this case, we've got company, last name, first name, and all of the data in that column is a uniform type of data, like they're all first names and all last names and all email addresses. In our file, that's not the case. Okay, it varies depending on the group of data. So this is going to be very interesting to see how you can bring all this in and parse it since you don't have a uniform type of data under a uniform header. So let's take a closer look at what we're going to do with this data. Now this data is going to be used to analyze an electric power system, which has, in the real world, it has hundreds or thousands of elements. All these different types of data. This is a very small version, but actually this could be hundreds or thousands of types of data. And it's used to analyze a large electrical power system. And each type of data represents actual real-world physical equipment. In this case, a bus data represents this photograph here, which is an electrical station that you may have seen on the road. Electrical power station, and there are 4 types of those electrical power stations represented in this first 4 lines. So what we're going to do is we're going to generate in our software a bus class, a generic bus class that describes in general this station, and we're going to make objects. We're going to for each line in this input file, we're going to make an object. So we're going to have 4 objects, which are instances of this generic bus class. And we're going to do the same for this, which is load data. These 4 are going to be objects of the load class. And same with the generators. We've got an electric power station here. This is equipment inside the power station. There's going to be 2 objects from a generic generator class. And the same thing from a line class, which models a transmission line that you've probably seen all over the place. And there are 4 objects from that class. So we now have to take this data, and each bit of data in each line is going to be a property in the object under this class. So we've got quite a bit of interesting work here to do to segregate these objects out and set the properties of each object with this data. Now, each of these objects is going to be part of an array. So in other words, I'm going to have, in this case, 4 objects, 4 bus objects that are in an array of bus objects. So this is going to be an array of 4 bus objects, and here an array of 4 load objects, and then 2 generator objects and 4 line objects. So I'm making what's called a system array class that holds all of these arrays of objects. Okay, so I've got a lot of objects in arrays that are going to be properties in this sysArray class. Okay, so somehow I have to take each line of data and set the properties of the corresponding object and put that into this array class that's holding all of the arrays for all of this information. So as you can see here, each object in the bus class is going to have these properties, and I'm going to have to take each, like this 230 is going to be one property of one of the bus objects, and I've got to set that property to 230. The next one's going to be a property I set to 3, and so on. So the question is, how am I going to do that? That seems like a lot of work to parse that and to set properties of objects generated from these classes. Well, actually, there is a free library that does that in very, very few lines of code, and very useful in basically taking lines of data, parsing, and setting properties of objects. Does that almost directly. And that's called CSV Helper. Now, there are other libraries out there freely available that you can use, but this is just one that I've used and found it very useful. Now, if you want to use that, to install it in Visual Studio, you open your solution, and under Tools, NuGet Package Manager, you select the Package Manager console, and you get a command line console. And you enter install -package CSV Helper, and that will install CSV Helper. Then in your project, you just add a using statement using CSV Helper. Okay, so I'll assume you've got that done and you're ready to start designing your application to read in a CSV file. So let's first thing I like to do whenever I'm developing software is design and think about first how I'm going to design the application. Well, here I've got the file, the CSV file that I'm going to read in. It's basically that file that I showed you before that's got all this data. What I'm going to do is I'm going to break this into 2 parts. Now, again, you can see there's a lot of different types of information, and we're going to have to segregate each type of data. So the first thing we need to do in order to set up our objects, our class objects, and make arrays of them, it would be nice to know how many of each type of data exist in this file. So in other words, I need to know that there's 4 buses, there's 4 loads, 2 generators, and 4 lines. If I have those numbers, then I can instantiate an array of these objects, and it'll make it a lot easier for me. So what I want to do is first go through this file and figure out how many of each type of object or each line of or each type of data are in the file. So I need to know there's 4 buses, 4 loads, and so on. So the way I'm going to do that is I'm going to pre-process that file. I'm just basically going to open it up and step through each line and count 1, 2, 3, 4 bus objects, 4 load objects, 2 generator objects, and 4 line objects. Which means I'm going to have to make note, I'm going to have to recognize that the 0 ends that type of data. So I count the number of lines until I hit a 0. When I'm done, I jump on to the next one and read the next until I hit a 0. Okay? So that's what I'm going to do. I'm going to have a method set up, which I call a preprocessor. And that's going to do basically a standard open file dialog where the user can open up a file dialog, select the file, and do a standard stream reader. Okay, and then it will step through and, using the stream reader, read each line and count the elements, and it will put the numbers of elements in an integer array. So this first element in the array will say 4 because there are 4 buses. So the int array element 0 will have a number 4 in it. Int array element 1 will have the number 4 in it. Int array element 3 will have a 2 in it, and so on. Okay, so I'll just go through, I'll open up the file, preprocess, and come up with a array that has the counts of each elements. And also I'll need to use the file name of the file, the result of the open file dialog, because I'm going to then open up the file again and actually do the reading and parsing and setting the object properties. So my first method just going to be a preprocessor to go through each record and count the elements. And the next one, I'm going to do another method, and it's going to read and parse the file using the CSV helper library, and that will set the object properties for each of the objects. So each of these 4 bus objects, I will have instantiated objects, and it will just set the properties of those objects. So here in my system array class, for example, bus 0, which is the 0th element, which is this 0th element in the bus arrays, is going to have a name. So I will read in this line, and CSV helper will immediately extract that name, recognize that this bus class has a property of name, and set that property for me. So really very, very useful. So let's take a look at the code I'm using. And this is a general analysis code, but I've got the 2 methods that I just talked about are here. These 2 methods, one will do a pre-processing and one will do a actual parsing and reading the input CSV file. Now I also mentioned that I've got some classes that I'm going to use to hold the arrays of all these objects, and each object is going to have its own class. So for example, the first line in the code is going to be the bus, and here is my bus class, and it's basically got 4 properties: the bus number, the name, bus KV, and bus type. And as you recall, I've got the bus number, which is the first element, the name, the second element, which is a string, and the KV and the type. Okay, so I'm setting up those properties to correspond with what I'm getting from the input file. Okay, so same thing with the line. I've got all these properties that I will set using the CSV helper, and so on. So I've also got an array class, and basically this is another class that holds the array of all of these objects. Okay, it's basically a container to hold all of the arrays of objects, and that's this right here. I've got the buses, the generators, the lines, and so on. So now I've got, in my main application, I've got these 2 methods that I'm going to call to first preprocess and then read. And let's take a look now at the preprocessor. And this is fairly straightforward. Basically, I've got here in one of the first lines, this is where I am instantiating an array which holds the number of elements. So in the 0th array of the elements, it will have the number of bus elements. And the first array will have the number of load elements, and so on. So I'm just instantiating a new array new array of the number of elements of each category of object. And then these lines are just a simple, standard open file dialog where I'm filtering text. You can also do CSV. and then you select the text file, and you specify the initial directory, and then I just do the open file dialog 1, show dialog, and here I do a using stream reader. This is very standard stream reader, so I won't go through details in this, but this using statement is where I do the work. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to step through each line. Here I've set some initial variables that we'll talk about. But here I'm going to step through each line in the file. And here I've got streamreader.readLine. So it will read a line, assign that to the line input string. And as long as it's not null, in other words, as long as it's not at the end of the file, it's going to do this. So it's going to read the first line, and let's take a look at our lines of in the file. So it's going to read the first line if the first character, line input value 0 in the line input array, is a /, then continue, which means just go on to the next element in the while loop. So the first line it's going to read, it's going to have this comment, so it's going to see that it's a /, so it's going to continue and then read the next line. And the next line, as you can see, has got a /, it's a comment, so it's going to do a continue and then read the next line. This line, it's going to have a number. So it's read it. It's not a /, so if it's the case ID Boolean is false, which I've said here, I've initialized case ID read Boolean to false. If it's false, then set it to true and continue. All that means is if I haven't read this first line, continue on to the next. Read it and continue, because we don't need to know anything about this line. We're only concerned about these different elements. This basically says, okay, we've read the first line, the first non-comment line, and just continue. So now we're going to go down to this line, and it's a comment, so it's going to continue. Now we've got the first line of real data. So it's read that first line. It's not a comment. ID read, we've already done that. So now if the first element is a 0, do this. In this case, it's not. It's a 1. So we increment num elements I. And I is 0, which means it's the number of elements in the 0th array, which is the number of buses. Okay? So we're saying the number of elements in the 0th array is 1 now, because I've just hit the first line. Then I go to the next line. It's not a comment. I've already read the first line. It's not a 0, therefore increment. We've hit another element, so we increment the 0th element to 2. And so on until we get to the 0 here. So we're going to get down. If it's equal to 0, then I++, increment this to say, okay, now we're going to be incrementing the first element of that array, which means the load data. So I'm incrementing that and continuing. So basically, that's how it goes through and counts each type of data. It waits for a 0, then increments and says, okay, now start counting the next type of data. And once we're done with that, it will close the stream and we're all set. So basically it just steps through and gets all that data. Now, here I am basically just setting the results. Here's the num element 0, which is the number of buses. And I'm setting a property in this overall sysArray class to that number of buses, which is the 0th element. And then number of loads to the first element, and so on. Because my array class has properties, num buses, num loads, num shunts, num gens, and so on. So I'm just setting those properties, and so anybody can now access that information. So the pre-processing is pretty straightforward. It just steps through using that logic. Now, the actual reading in and setting the properties of the objects happens in this CSV Reader class, okay? It's a private void. It takes no input and returns no input. So the CSV Reader method uses the system.io text reader, which basically reads a sequential series of characters from a file name, or from a file with a given name. So in order to access this, you're going to need a using statement for system.io as a reference, okay? So using this text reader, and we'll call it text reader, and we'll do file, open text, and we will use the file name that we generated from this preprocessor. Okay, we already did the file name, and we got the file name here, and we just passed that as a value, as a property that we can now access. So now the CSV helper uses this text reader object to step through and parse this file. So the first thing we need to do is instantiate an array of buses or bus objects in the system array class. Okay, so here we're just instantiating an array of each type of object, and this is the class that they're derived from. And the size of the array is the num buses, num loads, and everything that we came up with when we did the pre-processing. So here I'm just instantiating the objects, the array of objects. Now here is when we call the CSV Reader that is from the CSV helper library. And we say CSV, we're going to call it CSV, is a new CSV Reader. And it's using this text reader that we just instantiated up here. So CSV Reader, the CSV object is what's going to be doing the reading. Okay, so there are a few configuration things we can initially set with CSV to help us out going through and parsing. Now we said this file, the CSV file, has some comments. And the CSV Reader can automatically skip over comments if you tell it what character, first character in the line is a comment. So there is a configuration property with the CSV Reader called CSV configuration.comment, and you set it to the character of the comment. And we're using a /. So now you're saying, okay, jump over anything with a / in the first character. Also, CSV configuration allow comments, set that's normally false, set that to true to allow that to recognize these comments, that this with a / and step over it. And the other thing we need to set is CSV configuration has header record equals false, because we said there is no header record here. Each group of data has different data, so it's not all common data. So we set out these three configurations for this file to help us read through it a little bit easier. So the first thing you do is you do CSV read, and all that does is it advances the reader, the CSV Reader, to the next record. Okay, so now we're on this first record, which is a comment, on this first record, which is a comment. And then we're saying that the CSV get record, this is a very powerful statement. It basically gets the first non-comment record, because we've already told it skip over any comments. So it reads until the first non-comment record. And now, so we're at this line with this data. So it's going to get that record, and it's going to take the data in that record and set the properties in this case ID class that we have. Okay, and case ID up here is a very simple class with these two properties, ID number and MVA basis, another number. So basically it's going to just populate or set the property based on that value directly, okay? So the next thing we do, we've passed over this, so then it's going to skip this because it's a comment, and now we're going to be down to the next line. The CSV read is going to skip down to this next line, and now we're on the first line of bus data. So it's going to get that record and set the properties in the bus class object specified by this bus array. And it's going to populate all of the properties in that are in that line of code. It's going to set all the properties in this ith element bus object in the sysarray class. So this is a very powerful statement. It goes through for I equals 0 to the number of buses. So it's going to go 4 times, step through this, read a line, get the record, and populate the object associated with each line in the sysarray class. So it's going to go 0, 1, 2, 3, 4. So now that we already know that there's only going to be 4 records because we did the pre-processing. So we know after 4 records, you can skip the next line because it's going to be a 0. Okay? So here we have a CSV read which just skips over because we know it's a 0. It's going to skip over the next line. And the line after that is a comment. CSV Reader is automatically going to ignore that for us. So then it's going to be on to the load data. And it's going to do exactly the same thing. Up to the number of loads, which we know is 4. So from 0 to 4, it's going to read the line, get the record, populate the properties of the 0th load object from the load class, and just step through and do that. So really that's about it. It is extremely simple to go through because this CSV helper directly takes the line and populates an object made out of a class, populates that property. So it's very simple. Just these few lines of code, you can convert that CSV file into an array of objects and set all their properties all together. So that's about it. That's one very useful library that you might want to consider for reading CSV files. So I hope this helps. Take care and have a very good day.